Hello, everyone. Gunita here from the 1947 Partition Archive. Welcome to day 37 of 75 Days of Partition. We started this series on June 3rd, the day that the Mountbatten Plan for Partition was announced, and it's going to go on for 75 days till August 17th when the Radcliffe Line was announced. It just happens to be a coincidence that this time difference is 75 days, and this is the 75th commemoration of partition going on this year. So today I'd like to welcome Debanjan Das. So let's get Debanjan here. So Debanjan is going to be continuing what Fahad was doing, which is the timeline of events that happened between June and August 1947. So Debanjan has worked on this research with Fahad in our apprenticeship program last year as a researcher, and he recently completed his degree in history, his bachelor's degree in history from St. Stephen's College, if I'm correct. Is that correct, Debanjan?
Yes.
Yeah. So welcome to the program, and how are you doing?
It has been quite interesting to work on this entire project of, going into the archive, though not physical archives per se, though it's a digital thing, but it's very interesting to look into the various events, how everything transpired over the course of what I mean. As we go through the newspapers, we see history in the making and how the minute processes unfolded over a period of time into making into a larger event or a process which perhaps continues till this day. So yeah, it has been wonderful looking at these newspapers, and I think I got to learn a lot over this entire period that I've been working on this project. So yeah, it has
Have
been a
you
wonderful.
also been looking at Bengali language newspapers?
Not really, because it's difficult to access them online. Mostly, I've been looking at the English language newspapers, both Fahad and I, and because Fahad doesn't know Bengali, so it's better if we just, for the time being, I know it's not exhaustive what we are doing, but yeah, because of the language issue, we are sticking to English language newspapers as of now.
That makes sense. Well, if you have a presentation, we can pop it up right now. I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the happenings in July 1947.
Yeah, so okay, the presentation is here. So
Okay.
I'll be.
What's going on here? 4th of July, that's American Independence Day, coincidentally. So what's going on here?
Yeah, so I'll be looking at the events of this week. This is again by no means exhaustive. I had to cherry pick a lot of events which I felt would help in a better understanding of what transpired during partition, and something which I personally might have found interesting or in the context of larger global history, especially in the context of the global process of decolonization and everything. So I'll be looking at the dates between 4th of July and the 10th of July 1947. So on the 4th of July, the headlines was that the India Bill here, the Government of India Bill, is to be introduced in the British Parliament. It is supposed to be introduced. Now, this process of partition and everything had been going on since 1946, and even like a month before and everything, the boundaries were not clear. There were contested claims over territory, over which were on the basis of communal identity or ethnic identity. So if you notice on the larger clipping on the top, so we see that there's an Afghan claim on India's borderland. Uh, so
That's
we can
interesting.
see.
What does that mean? Tell us.
Yeah, so in the Northwest frontier provinces, there was, as we know, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan led the Red Shirts movement, where they demanded a separate state for the Pathans, who were the residents, who were ethnically, who were indigenous to that area. So there was, on one hand, they who had been demanding a separate state, independent of India or Pakistan, for themselves, while on the other hand, both Pakistan and Afghanistan had been claiming this land for their own. Now, here we can see that Afghanistan trying to claim that area as their own. Then one can also see that the newspaper has noted the key uh, provisions of the Government of India bill in that, and it was to be introduced on the 4th of July for discussion in the Parliament. Now, the smaller clipping below shows like how there were anti-partition day hartals all over India. So, as we know, a large number of groups had opposed the partition of India on for various reasons.
And can you tell
Uh,
our viewers who don't know the meaning of hartals, because that's not an English word, can you explain that to our viewers?
Hartals can simply refer to a strike or a demonstration, basically matlab shutdown of various services as a means of protest. It can be non-violent also, but as we see, hartals usually turn violent over a period of time as the protesters try to enforce shutdowns and clash with the law enforcement agencies and also. Yeah, so this period again saw a number of hartals or shutdowns that in order to protest against the proposed partition as of
Interesting.
now. On the right hand side, there's a clipping on the formation of a national coalition government in Asia. Now, though this is not directly linked to the partition of India, but in the larger global scheme of things, this period is also crucial uh, because post Second World War, there was a acceleration in the process of decolonization as Europe was uh, ruined economically, and also for other political reasons, it became impossible to hold on to the former colonies. So, post 1945, we see a gradual disintegration of the colonial empires, with Britain losing most of its territory over the next few decades. So we see that. So, and in another slide also, we'll see the progress of how there was a contestation between the Indonesian nationalists and the Dutch forces over, which finally culminated into the independence of Indonesia.
Oh,
Now,
wow. And when was that? When was that exactly?
mm, exactly, I cannot recall the date, but it was, I think, in the early 1950s, like
Okay.
1951, 50. I might
So
be wrong.
basically,
So
India influenced. What happened in India influenced what happened in
I mean, we
Indonesia.
can look at it at a larger context. Like, for instance, some of the Congress leaders were supportive of the independence struggle of Indonesia. So, for instance, Nehru was a enthusiastic supporter of this. That can be seen in the friendship that blossomed between Sukarno and Nehru, which eventually was crucial to the formation of the NAM in the 1950s. So, yeah, all of these were connected in that way, even if not they were directly linked, like one influencing the other, but in the larger global picture they were all like connected.
Right.
So on the 5th of July we see that uh, the Indian Independence Bill was introduced in Commons the day before. As we saw, it was supposed to be introduced on the 4th, so it was now introduced as well. And we see also the continuation of uh, the contestation over the territory in the northwest frontier province with Afghanistan claiming a portion of the territory as well. Uh, then we see again, to focus on the larger picture of decolonization, the left hand side article shows a proposal to divide Palestine into Israel, uh, which eventually culminated in the formation of
That
Israel
is
in
so interesting.
1948.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is
so
from 5th July, 1947, just to remind everybody.
so this was a proposal back then, but the UN eventually came up with a proposal of their own over the course of the late 1940s, which was again contested, and over a period of time, a number of wars between the Arab forces and the Israelis took place, and well, the issue remains unresolved even today. So yeah, so we see an unfolding of that taking place in this newspaper clipping as well, a small part of it at least.
Very
Uh,
interesting.
then at the bottom, we see that the Paris conference is, it talks about the Paris conference and uh, now the Anglo and the French cooperation over expressing problems over Soviet satellites. Now again, post 1945, we see an escalation of tensions between the US and the USSR over their each other over the expansionist policies espoused by each other, as a result of which, as we know, it culminated into a Cold War. Though there was no direct war as such between the US and the USSR, it led to a number of proxy wars in different parts of Europe as well as in parts of Asia as well. And it continued till, as you know, till 1991 when the USSR was dissolved.
Can you talk
Then
a little bit more about the proxy war and how far back you would say it goes?
As far as going far back, I mean, there is a dispute over, of course, like we can't really trace exactly the date when it began, but still around immediately after the Second World War, like two power centers was the destruction of Germany once and for all, with the partition of Germany into East and West Germany, and over and the division of Europe into two blocks. We see increasing hostility emerging between the US and the USSR over each other's expansionist
Over
policies, which
control of
we eventually see in the division of uh, major European powers into two blocks, the NATO and the Eastern Alliance, which again fought like proxy wars were fought in various parts of Eastern Europe also, and also in parts of, for instance, Afghanistan was a major area of proxy war
yeah,
over the course of the 1970s and 80s, which again, as we know, is an issue which,
devastating impact on Afghanistan. It's been a side effect, not of their fault, of these two superpowers.
yeah, something which has continued even after 1991, and the
We're
effects of
seeing it
which
now
are
in
still
Ukraine.
felt today. Yeah, so that at the right hand side, at the we see that the Sir Cyril Radcliffe was appointed as the chairman of the Boundary Committee. Now, interestingly, Sir Cyril Radcliffe had no idea about exactly how to, matlab, how do I put it? So he had not done much of field work, and his only way of ensuring the demarcation of the territories was through older maps, which were commissioned by the British over the course of their expansion in the 19th and the 20th century. So again, this entire arbitrary marking of a line, which would eventually represent the territories of the new independent states, would create a lot of problems, as we know, during partition, as sometimes lines would cut across villages, then sometimes even cutting across fields, somebody's fields, for instance. Then certain areas were declared no man's land because to meet the requirements of the international boundaries, as a result of which people lost their livelihood, their homes, and everything. They were just stuck somewhere in between in a no man's land. And of course, the communal tensions as a huge mass of population shifted from one side to the other, and the interim, the carnage that took place. So yeah, this is just a month before the proposed transfer of power. So it
Just
is,
so haphazard.
yeah, because even after the independence, as we know, a lot of areas were not sure where they actually lied in, whether
Right.
in India or Pakistan. So the, I mean, this quickness at which it was done, but the disaster that it created.
Yeah,
Next slide,
absolutely.
please.
So this is the
Ah,
6th of July.
so 6th July. So I found this was the top clipping. I found it extremely interesting because uh, I tried to look for other sources which corroborated it, like Pakistani saboteurs at work to disorganize telephones with an attempt to cut off Assam and Kashmir for the rest of the world. Again, I tried to look for corroborating evidence, but I couldn't find it. Maybe there is something, but it's not something that I could find. But again, uh, newspapers again are a very important, though they are an important source and are perceived to be neutral as such, but again, sometimes the way things are worded and everything, the editorial policies of newspapers, especially in times when, in momentous times such as these, which can reflect a kind of bias and everything. So this particular newspaper was a nationalist newspaper which was tilted, towards the Congress. So I'm not very sure exactly what happened here, like the telephone disorganized. It must have been an important event, though, to make it to the front page in such bold headlines. But yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't find any corroborating evidence for that.
I want to point out something here. I want to pause you for a second.
Please.
I think what you just said is really important and something that sometimes I don't see historians talking about is that when we look at newspapers, when we take what we find in newspapers in the past as like the holy grail, when we base our research on the past on newspapers and sort of the written word, the traditional archive, we aren't taking into account the fact that there's biases, that there are editorial policies, that you've got all these layers, right? If I were to go ahead, 50 years from now, if I were to look back at newspapers today, wouldn't there be a massive dissociation between what the newspapers are saying versus what the actual people's history is? That's why I kind of feel like you need, oral history as well. But I think this was what you said was really important in that regard. I think it's important to look at the human bias when it comes to these written records as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like not just newspapers, but archival material in general tend to be very statist in nature. That is, since archives are usually state repositories, so what the way information is put in, like the kind of information that goes into an archive, for instance, which and how it is prioritized and everything is all dependent on how the state wants to, organize information or how the state wishes to portray information as well. So, for instance, we see often historians discovering, parts of an archive which are not catalogued well, but which are, say, for instance, extremely important in order to, say, unfold parts of, which the state would probably not want to look at or the state is not interested in. To give an example,
Absolutely.
for instance, like sometimes especially this is seen in feminist histories and also, for instance, in labor histories, and especially of marginalized groups, which do not, are which though they come under state policy, these groups, but sometimes, well, they are grossly neglected by the state and information and because as a result of prioritization of certain discourses over the others, these archival materials are often relegated to the background and are not perceived as important by the state.
Right,
So
right.
okay,
So
it's a bit
important what you said, Debanjan.
yeah. So now coming back to all of this, so yeah, so the yeah, so again the last three newspapers clippings are sort of interconnected with each other. So, as we know that the India Independence Act, gave the option to the princely states. So, for those who might be unaware, uh, British India was divided into what we call the British Indian provinces, as well as a huge number of princely states scattered across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, which were under the suzerainty of the British government, but they enjoyed certain degrees of autonomy of their own. So the rulers were given the chance to decide whether they would want to join India or Pakistan or remain independent. Now, while most of the territories joined either of the unions, keeping in mind the territorial contiguity, there were some troubles over mm, some states joining. So here in this context, if we see, so the middle cutout says Patel's impassioned appeal to recalcitrant states. So we see that Sardar Patel, whom in India we refer to as Iron Man for his ability to persuade, sometimes through negotiations or by force, to accede parts of the subcontinent which were not willing to join India or decided to stay independent. So, uh, so here we see Patel making an appeal to the states which were not willing to join India. Then, so one of the most important states which refused to join India was Hyderabad. So Hyderabad was finally annexed in 1948 after a long drawn struggle, with the Indian Army finally launching Operation Polo and taking over the state of Hyderabad, which had been beset by a lot of peasant rebellions organized by the Communist Party of India, as well as protests by the state congress there. So here we see that the Nizam, and I think we'll also see it in a couple of other dates as well, that the Nizam wanted to invade Berar. So Berar was just above the dominion of the state of Hyderabad. So, and in the Vidarbha region, which which is a part of present day Maharashtra now. So here we see that there was a threat given by the Nizam to occupy Berar, and we see Congress leaders, threatening, matlab, uh, they trying to, persuade or asking the Nizam, appealing to the Nizam to not, and also threatening it, the state of Hyderabad with dire consequences.
So I want to pause you here for a second. You're saying that many of these newspapers were pro-state. Sometimes, as you know, I'm not saying that this is what happened in this instance, but sometimes news is even placed in these sort of pro-state newspapers. This has been known around the world in modern times to create a certain aura, or to give the government a certain reason to maybe invade, to do something, to take a certain action. So sometimes there can be inaccuracies. Do you think that could be possible in this case?
Yes, maybe, because in this case it might have been so, because like uh, Nizam of Hyderabad till the very end was not relenting to the pressures of the interim government, and yeah, that might be a case, but yeah, but in this context, yeah, that might not be, because like way Berar was positioned, there might have been an actual that how far it would have been successful is a different question, one of the what
Right.
ifs, but still it might have been a part of the Nizam's aggressive policy in order to, trying to assert his dominance, perhaps. But yeah, I'm not very sure again, but
It would be neat to see if there are other documentations of what was going on, because as we know, that's a very contested history still. And it would be really, really interesting, but a very fascinating news piece.
okay. The next
We move on to the 7th of July? Or is this the 7th or still the 6th?
no, it's a continuation of the
Okay.
sixth. So here we see Gandhi trying to, as we see, Gandhi had mm, tried to make a reconciliatory gesture towards, tried to maintain a certain sense of reconciliatory attitude towards both India and Pakistan, and post independence is said to have made, like, asked the Indian government to live up to the uh, provisions of the bill as well, with regards to funds and etc., and division of resources, etc., which allegedly the Indian government was not giving proper share to Pakistan. So we see a huge clip cutting off how Gandhi points out how the ideals of, I mean, the ideals which led to the birth of India and Pakistan are contradictory to each other, and how it might disrupt any sort of reconciliatory gestures towards each other. And perhaps it's the way it turned out to be, because as we see that there seems to be no end to the Indo-Pak conflict anytime soon.
Oh,
Then,
sorry. Can you repeat that? Because I think we couldn't hear you as the audience.
okay,
As it turns
am I
out.
audible?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically what I
Oh,
was
now
saying
it's
is
much
that,
better. Yeah.
yeah, so basically what I was saying is that Gandhi in general was, at least in public, was mm, very extreme, I mean, highly opposed to the division of partition of in the subcontinent. So, and it is believed that Gandhi, post independence, had also organized, lodged his protests with the new government of India in order to give Pakistan its due share of resources as outlined in the various agreements and acts. So, here, and Gandhi envisioned a sort of friendly relationship existing between India and Pakistan, but again, he also knew perhaps the practical difficulties involved. And here we see that there's a, uh, I mean, what we see is Gandhi commenting on the conflicting ideals that led to the birth of India and Pakistan, and how perhaps the very basis of formation of both these states make any sort of reconciliation a bit difficult that way. So, yeah. Then on the right side, we see that President Truman making a speech on the Independence Day on 4th of July, which again, which reads as dictatorship blocking way to world peace. So again, this the period of 1940s and 50s, as the process of decolonization accelerated and everything, most of the new states that emerged either tried to model themselves on the liberal democratic traditions that they had somewhat inherited from their former colonial masters. And
I think we're having trouble hearing you again.
again,
Yeah,
am I audible?
yes, now you're audible.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that post the process of
Right. So a
post
lot of states were modeling themselves after democratic.
their the liberal democratic model of their former colonial masters. So
Right.
which again proved to be fragile in a lot of contexts.
Right.
Pakistan being a key example of that, because sometimes, because the way the process of decolonization took place, it and the conditions in which the new constitution, some of the constitutions were drafted, it gave sweeping powers to the executive, suspension of civil rights, and everything. So, and again, this
So what is
speech
this
can.
article about? Yeah, by Truman. This is really interesting. What does he say in this speech? Because we can't
Uh,
read it on the screen.
so basically, so again, so one of the reasons why, uh, in the context, if we contextualize it within the context, within the Second World War era, so we see that uh, the concentration of power in Germany and Italy by the fascist forces was seen as an important reason why it led to the defeat, because I mean, it was portrayed as they didn't enjoy the sovereignty of the people and etc. And again, and if post uh, Second World War, if we look at it in the context of the Cold War as well, we see that the US and the USSR followed two completely different models of government, with the US hailing itself as the beacon of democracy and of republican values, while it denounced USSR for being a one party dictatorship under a one man. So again, it might be
And
a,
is that what Truman is talking about in this article?
in general, he talks about how dictatorship can be a menace to the entire, the fragile world peace that eventually, that was hard to find over the course of the 1930s and 40s. So perhaps, yes.
Okay. And then what do we have in the bottom article here?
Oh,
Kramer captures Wimbledon. Yeah.
this is a bit interesting because again, it's like how newspapers focus on different things at different points of time. So even in such momentous times, we see um, newspapers capturing important achievements in sports, etc. So yeah, that's
While
why
we're having, yeah, all this upheaval due to partition.
yeah, partition and in general over the world also, it was not really the most peaceful times and
Yeah.
everything. So again, I found it very interesting how a newspaper which is based in Kolkata is also which is going through a momentous time such as this.
And
Also
what
found it.
newspaper is this? Can you remind everybody?
This is Amrita Bazar Patrika.
Okay.
It's it was mostly in circulation in Kolkata and parts of North India. So
Okay. So we
and
probably have to
for
end soon after maybe one more slide because I think we've gone much over
uh,
time.
okay.
So we're
Yeah,
on the
so
7th of July.
yeah. So on the 7th of July, we see, we see how the Sylhet district, which is presently a part of Bangladesh, became a bone of contention again because, because again, it was subjected to a referendum because of its overwhelming Hindu Bengali population, and it is alleged that the Muslim League tried to sabotage the election process. I mean, the process of referendum there by deploying a reign of terror and everything, led to the pa- which led to the province being becoming a part of Bangladesh and led to one of the most terrible killings, I mean genocides that took place there. I'll
So can you tell
quickly
us a
go
little bit about the genocide? And this is in
Sylhet.
Sylhet, okay?
So Sylhet was a province uh, which is now in the eastern part of Bangladesh, bordering Assam. So it was a major area where the Hindu Bengalis live. So again, it became a bone of contention because, like, it is alleged that the province of Assam didn't really want it to become a part of Assam as well because over the entire ethnic identity politics there, and at the same time, it would have been the Muslim League tried to sabotage the entire election process. I mean, the referendum that was held in Sylhet over whether it wanted to join East Pakistan or India by not allowing people to vote in general. So there was an overwhelming, I think over 90% vote in favor of joining East Pakistan, which I which a lot of observers said was rigged in a fashion, and it led to one of the worst communal carnages taking place, with a lot of refugees from the Sylhet district moving to different parts of northeast India and Bengal over a period of time.
Well, just to be totally fair, we know of many. Well, first of all, we want to remind ourselves that the newspapers are probably only reporting one side because these are Indian newspapers, right? And that there were Hindu right groups in the area who were active as
Mhm,
well, because we hear about them in
mhm,
our oral histories. So there was more to the story probably than what we're seeing
mhm.
here alone.
For instance, I mean, in various parts, the Hindu Mahasabha was also very
Yes,
strong and also a strong proponent of partition that way. So, yeah, we
right,
cannot
right.
really ignore the Hindu right as well here. Just quickly going through it. So, here we see a number of Sikh groups also opposing transfer of power before the actual process of partition taking place.
The
And
Sikhs,
as
okay.
we Yes, and as we know, Punjab became the hotbed of communal politics at this time, and one of the worst mm, and highly volatile transfer of population from one side to the other, which continued for a long time, took
Right.
place
And
as a result.
what does this article talk about exactly? What are this? What are they opposing here in this particular article?
So basically, since the boundaries were exactly not decided, and still there was a lot of haggling between the various interest groups for their share of territories. So, what these Shi groups were opposing were to wait till the boundaries are finalized for a final transfer of power, which again seems to be perhaps would have been a better alternative had it taken place a much more systematic manner, because it was chaotic, indeed chaotic, and extremely
Definitely.
well mismanaged that way. So hmm, again we see that the Indian bill puts onus on new dominions. British imperialism gives free hand to the princely order. I have
So they're
discussed
at
it
the
in
bottom of the screen
earlier.
now.
Yeah, and here again we see that the Nizam government supplying arms to Muslims exclusively. Again, the wording of this title headline is a
Mhm.
bit weird, because again uh, the Nizam had a private militia of their own, which indeed was called the Razakars, who were extremely brutal towards all forms of protests, and beat against the Nizamate over the peasant uprisings or the protests by the Congress. But again, in the communalized atmosphere such as these headlines
Yeah, I want to
should
provide
be
the
taken
other
with a
grain
yeah.
of salt. I want to provide the other side of the story. So it wasn't just the Nizam. We know that
Hmm,
many Maharajas had their own militaries prior to partition.
hmm,
And after, India became independent, those militaries were considered militias, right?
hmm,
For example, a lot of the Maharajas in what ended up becoming Punjab in northern India, they did support extreme right Hindu and Sikh groups as well, who were
hmm,
armed.
hmm,
So
hmm,
I
hmm,
don't think it was just the Nizam. I wanted to point that out to balance,
hmm,
to
hmm,
give
hmm,
us balance.
hmm. Yeah, so I think I've covered everything here. Next slide, please. Yeah. So again, the Pathan's challenge to the Muslim League. So now in the Northwest Frontier province, we see, as I have told earlier, that there was a significant demand by the indigenous Pathans to declare it an independent state, which would be independent of India, Pakistan, or Afghanistan in this context. But the Muslim League here wanted to appeal to the local population on the basis of them being Muslims rather than being Pathans, and wanted it to become a part of Pakistan. So, though here it's mentioned that referendum on the basis of Pathanistan versus Pakistan, actually, in the options there was no provision for independence. Uh, so, as a result of which, the Khudai Khidmatgars, led by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, had to ended up boycotting the election, boycotting the referendum, because there was no provision for a separate Pathanistan province made in the referendum, and the overwhelming vote went to in favor of Pakistan. So we see here again referendum incidents in the Sylhet district. So again, it was not it. The referendum was indeed very violent over a period of time, with again allegations of rigging and everything. Then mm, next, here Ambedkar condemns the India Bill, light on Berar's position. British sowing seeds of disintegration in India. Now, again, the question of princely states becomes important here, as the provision of allowing them independence could backfire, because like it had the potential of breaking the territorial contiguity of the newly formed dominions, which would have been severely threatening to the sovereignty of either of the dominions that way. So, and could have the potential of, creating a state of proxy wars, or say
Right.
other conflicts which might have spilled over to their respective dominions as well. So, this became an important tool for what Ambedkar argues as a tool for disintegration, might end up in disintegration or a site of proxy wars and everything. Here we see a Congress League pact over control of commodities to remain till March 1948, with custom currency and coinage to be retained. So, uh, a common customs currency and coinage to be retained till about for a year.
That is so
So,
interesting because, I
hmm,
hear stories all the time of people either migrating from what became India to Pakistan or what became Pakistan to
hmm.
India and still being able to use their money. And I've always wondered about that, how long they were able to use their money.
Yeah, so we see at least till March 1948 they could have, and yeah, so before they began coining their own money and everything.
Right,
Again, Calcutta, we see a report from Calcutta where we see cases of acid and bomb attacks with numerous killed because Calcutta had been an important zone of communal conflict way since 1946 with both right-wing Muslim groups with the Muslim League, which was in government there, as well as role of groups like Hindu Mahasabha and sometimes the Congress also, because it tended, as argued by some scholars, overwhelmingly towards the Hindu right in at least in the context of Bengal. So as a result of which Calcutta became an important battleground between these various communal forces, and we
right,
keep on seeing reports of violence in Calcutta over the course of the 1940s, over 1946-47 and so on.
right. So I think
Next
let's do
slide.
one more
Yeah.
slide if you have one for the 9th of July, and then we will have to end the show because I think we've gone way over time. But it's been
Yeah.
so thought provoking, and it really contextualizes the history for everybody. I love that you've got these international headlines in here as well because it really puts into perspective what was going on in the rest of the world and all the forces that were acting together, including in the subcontinent.
So on 9 July 1947, we again see two common uh, newspaper articles on the frontier being prepared for the general elections with the demand for Pathanistan being a national urge. So again, I need not elaborate that again. It's a continuation of what was happening the previous day. Same again, transport services not functioning in Calcutta, curfew imposed on areas under jurisdiction of 7 police stations. So again, continuation of the disturbances that had been taking place. Then transfer of power to India is greatest Britain's great triumph, which is indeed interesting for a nationalist newspaper as such,
Right,
to put it that way. Uh,
right.
so and also it's interesting to see a first page headline on anti-Pakistan Day on protest against India's partition. So which again speaks a lot about the editorial policy of the newspaper as such to
Very
put it on the
interesting.
front page.
Right.
Then again, why Russia? So to contextualize, Marshall Plan was a post World War reconstruction plan, economic reconstruction plan of led by USA and its allies in order to rebuild Europe, which had been completely destroyed over the course of the Second World War. And as we see, because of the escalation of tensions between the US and the USSR over after the post World War, clearly they couldn't see eye to eye with each other and eventually had to back out of the Marshall Plan talks because they saw in this plan, as the newspaper headline says, an Anglo French design to dominate the European economy. Because loans were an important means to, help in rebuilding Europe, this would have, in case there were defaults and everything, it again could have led to proxy wars and emergence of proxy regimes, etc. So, yeah, uh, if we have
Very
time,
interesting. Sorry, what else would you like to talk about?
if there's time, there's just one more slide for 10th of July.
Okay, let's do
So,
it. Let's do it.
so I think it will complete. Again, so we see again a continuation of these things, parting by on Calcutta. So clearly, the tensions in Calcutta has escalated severely over the past few days with massacres of innocents in wake of funeral processions or there being carnages on the streets. So clearly, the situation has escalated and it would continue to be as such over the course of the next year or so. Uh, Then again, Nizam's plan of marching through Berar. We don't know if it happened actually. And interim federal government for whole of Indonesia. Again, it's a continuation of what had been the Dutch and the tensions between the Dutch and the Indonesian forces taking place. It would culminate only in the early 1950s. So again, yeah, I think that's it. I don't think there's any more slides.
Well, thank you so much. What I think another thing that's really interesting about the newspapers that you shared is a lot of people have this misnomer that there wasn't any violence in Bengal, not much happened there. But what we hear from our oral histories is that it was quite violent over there as well. And what we're seeing from your newspaper headlines is that a lot of those reports about the violence were actually making it into the newspapers. So I think that's really important and interesting. By the way, there's a really loud vacuum cleaner, not in our office, but outside our office. Hopefully you guys can still hear me.
Yeah, I think audio is fine. Just to add here, for instance, I mean, that oral histories can shed a lot of light on the violence and everything. So, uh, on my maternal grandparents' side, I have heard a lot of instances of communal violence taking place in the area that they lived because my maternal grandparents' home is situated in an area which is just adjoining uh, I mean, in Calcutta, the areas are divided communally extremely significant. I mean, very prominently. So it's located at the juncture of say of the beginning of a Hindu community and here an entirely Muslim area. Oh, I'm not audible. Now it's better.
Yes, it's better. Yeah.
So again, so my mother said that how one of her uncles had seen dead bodies lying on the streets during this entire period and how it severely affected his mental health to the point of him never recovering from it wholly. So
Yeah,
I
I can
mean,
imagine. That's quite
I
traumatic.
yeah, and I mean that there was no violence in Bengal is a bit weird that way. That people might think that way. I mean, probably because, like, again, it's because there's a lot more emphasis on Punjab, perhaps, but the carnage was perhaps much more increase, high or whatever as compared to Bengal. But again, in different parts of Northeast, also in Assam and everything, also there are incidents of communal violence which we don't look into. Like in Sylhet, for instance, there's barely any. For instance, in historical works, also there's barely very few historical works on Sylhet, for instance. So,
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. We do have a lot of oral history from there, but in terms of, I'm hoping that it's going to inspire more research. You know, a lot of times oral history is a first stop. It gives people ideas. Okay, this person has this memory. Let me go dig deeper and see if something like that actually happened, and it can lead to other things. So anyway, thank you so much, Debanjan, for coming today. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us for 75 Days of Partition. Again, I'm Gunita. I'm co-hosting this event series with Aprajita and Sonam Kalra. And we will have a guest appearance by Noor Chawla, who has been a popular host of ours for Sunday Stories. So please join us again. We are here every single day except Sundays at the same time. And we look forward to seeing you on Monday. And thank you so much for joining us, Debanjan.